What are core wounds? Do I have them? Where do they come from? How do they impact my relationship with my spouse, my kids, my friends, and my relationship with God? Hi, I'm Kim Pullen, and welcome to the Hope for Spouses Lunchtime Live. And I want to welcome everybody who's here. If this is your first time watching any of the videos from the Hope for Spouses, I especially want to welcome you and share a little bit about why I started this ministry. So it started about 1.5 years ago, and I did it because I was really alarmed at how many people who were going through something that I went through, which is being separated from my spouse because of his addiction to adultery. And he was a serial adulterer and had multiple affairs while we were married. And we were separated for 4 years, and we've been back together now for 4 years, and we have an incredible marriage. But I really wanted to give women and men who have unfaithful wives the hope that they can be reunited with their partner. There are a lot of factors involved with that, of course, but we can focus on what we need to work on. And one of those things is really finding out about core wounds and how they really impact our family, and that's our topic today. Now, before we dive in, I think it's really important that we all understand exactly what core wounds are. So I just want to kind of define it a little bit. Core wounds are basically any kind of trauma that happens to us, especially as children. Physical, mental, emotional, spiritual abuse of any kind, sexual abuse, any kind of abandonment, abuse or neglect. Essentially any kind of trauma. And that could be something as devastating as living through war in your hometown, or simply being neglected by a parent who spends too much time at work, or is so caught up in their own issues, their own depression or alcoholism or whatever, that they don't really have time to really raise their child in the way that God really designed it to. And what happens is these core wounds develop in us, and they have long-term implications on us emotionally and even physically. There's something called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, that have been recently introduced into the medical field, and they've really proven through research that these kind of trauma, these adverse childhood experiences, actually even affect us physically as far as diabetes, autoimmune disease, even cancer. And they are actually shorten our lifespan, especially if we don't address them as early as possible. So one of the things that I've even noticed is that a huge impact from these core wounds is shame. And the shame develops at a very young age, and basically Satan uses it as a weapon to cause disunity between us and God and us and other people. So what does this shame do? It makes us hide, which leads to isolation, which leads to the core wounds being buried deeper and basically keeping us from being discovered, these core wounds from being discovered inside of us and eventually healed. Now, who's to blame? I hear that a lot. Well, who's to blame for all this? Maybe it was my parents. But if we really go back, we're going to see it goes a lot further back than just our parents. And so ultimately, I really want us to walk away from the idea that these core wounds don't just come from our family. They actually come all the way back to the garden, where Satan really created a divide through the shame that he impugned on men through the sin that he helped to instigate. So the first thing we're going to talk about is where these core wounds come from. And really, if you are married and you are living with a betrayed spouse, a spouse who has either committed adultery or is addicted to pornography, then something that you're going to start to realize as you start working through your recovery is that these things were in their life, these core wounds, these things that maybe led to their unfaithfulness long before you met them, long before you got married, that they actually started when they were young. And these kind of sins, we call them transgenerational sins. And the scriptures talk about this in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. And it was during the time where God was handing out the 10 Commandments. And he said that one of the promises or one of the guarantees that he actually made in those 10 Commandments is that the sins of the children would visit themselves on the fathers, on the children to the third and fourth generation. Now, it wasn't that God was punishing them. He was simply stating a fact that children imitate what they see in their parents. And if that cycle isn't broken, then it will continue. And there's a new science out called epigenetics, and it's really validating this aspect of Scripture. Just Google epigenetics, and you'll find a lot of really interesting material that comes up about how these sins from our parents and our grandparents and even our great-grandparents have an impact on us today. Even if we never met these family members, they have a long-term effect on us. That this trauma that happened in their life and the eventual sin literally has been written into our DNA. And we can choose to follow our parents' or grandparents' or great-parents' path, or we can choose to not follow it. So it really comes down to us. And Ecclesiastes 18:20 talks about that the son does not inherit the guilt of the father, nor the father the guilt of the son. And ultimately, it really comes down to us making choices. But we have to be aware of those choices. And so that's why I really want to talk about core wounds today. Now, I'm going to give you a hypothetical situation, okay? So you have a man, a husband, all right? He found his father's porn stash when he was 8 years old. His father was an alcoholic. His parents were both unfaithful to each other and divorced when he was a teenager. They never set boundaries on him, or very limited boundaries. He got addicted to marijuana and became a petty drug dealer. He epitomized the idea of drugs, sex, and rock and roll. He became a womanizer. He eventually found God in college as a student, got married, straightened up his act for a short time, then became a serial adulterer and left his wife of 19 years with their 3 children, 2 of them with special needs, to live with an affair partner for a couple of years. Now, let's look at the wife. She's codependent. She has a codependent mother and a sex addict father as well. Both parents, so in other words, both of her grandparents' fathers, her grandfathers, were alcoholics. The father was a bank robber and a major drug smuggler. Her father spent 20 years of his life, almost a third of his life, in jail. Then he died of pancreatic cancer just 6 months after he was released from a very long sentence. She had a very poor emotional relationship with both of her parents. She became promiscuous at 7 years old, lost her virginity at 16, and slept around till she found God in college. She continued her codependent mothering patterns in her marriage, trying to control her spouse for fear she would end up like her parents. Now, it is no wonder, it is no surprise that these 2 people who got married separated for 4 years. They were both incredibly broken from their childhood, lots of core wounds. But both broken people together can still have an amazing marriage. Of course, but God has to be at the center of it. And the reason I know this is because this marriage, this husband and this wife, are me and my husband. And yes, we went through all of that stuff. And yes, we have an amazing marriage today. But I'm not the only couple that's happened to. There are couples that have proven that this can be true, that we can have reconciliation. We can have a healthy marriage in spite of major core wounds. But it takes super hard work. And both people have to be willing to work diligently on their relationship with God, the relationship with their spouse, and working with other spiritual people in their life. If any of these parts is missing, then the marriage is going to suffer for it, and it's going to take much, much longer for the reconciliation and the healing to happen. Now, most people, and I'm going to say this especially men, because women tend to talk more and kind of offload their emotions. Guys tend to bury things deep down. But most men barely acknowledge their core wounds. Most don't even know that they have them. They think that infidelity, and I'm not saying all men, but a lot of them, especially the ones who are addicts and who have been unfaithful to their spouses, Most of them think that infidelity or porn or treating women like objects or pursuing the world is normal because it's what they saw in their family of origin. And even the ones who have developed a conscience, whose hearts have not been hardened, they know that it's wrong, but because it's the only thing they know from their childhood, they actually act out just like their fathers did. Now, both men and women, for both men and women, our shame of these wounds makes us tuck those memories away into our subconscious because as children, we don't have the tools to process this trauma that happens to us. Now, there's a film that came out probably maybe 15, 20 years ago now called The Prince of Tides. It starred Nick Nolte and Barbara, I can't remember her name, the singer. You probably know who it is. I can't remember her name. Anyway, so they start in this movie and she plays a psychologist who helps the character of Nick Nolte really discover why he's got all these issues currently in his life. And it was because he was sexually abused as a child. But he had hidden all that stuff even from himself because he didn't have the tools to really work through it. Robin Wiedner, who is a pioneer in the area of dealing with recovery, especially for women, wrote a book called Grace Calls. And it is amazing. She really shares in-depthly how she worked through a lot of the trauma from her childhood. And she even shares in that book an example of when, as she was drawing closer to God and asking God to uncover these things inside of her, all these memories flooded back to her of abuse from her childhood. And that's what can tend to happen is our brain protects us from those things. But they don't ever go away. Even if we ignore them, they never really go away. And there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's written by a doctor, but it's written in as much layman's terms as we can understand so that you can grasp it. But it really does talk about how our body literally retains the trauma from our childhood. And unless we learn to work through it, it is going to manifest itself in all kinds of issues in our life. So ignoring the fact that we have core wounds, it's like the damage becomes worse because, it's like the impact of imagine not mowing your yard or weeding your yard at all for months or years. Now we know what happens because we may have people in our neighborhood who have not done that. And we know how that it just creeps in. Well, it's the same thing with these core wounds in our life. If we are not dealing with them, if we're not getting to the root and pulling them out by the root, they infest themselves into every area of our life. They overwhelm us. And it makes it much, much more difficult for us to eventually get to the root of them. So even if we had what we consider great parents who stayed faithful to each other, we still have core wounds. We all have them. Nobody can escape them. And it's because we're all sinners. There's not a person on the planet. If the Bible is to be believed, there's not a person on the planet who hasn't sinned. And so therefore, your parents had sin, their parents had sin, their parents had sin, all the way back. All of us have sin, and our sin affects our children. It affects everybody around us. So, and even if we had a marriage that started off with God at the center, there is no guarantee that one of the partners won't regress. That was my marriage. My husband and I started with God at the center of our marriage, but because neither of us dealt with our core wounds, it all came out eventually. Things happen, illness, accidents, jobs, children, issues with our family of origin, and these undealt with core wounds. So it's super important that we're aware of them and we really go after trying to change them. So now, how do these childhood core wounds impact us in our adulthood and in our marriage? So what ends up happening is these core wounds almost create a lens or glasses, okay, that through which as we become adults, we literally view the world through that lens. So that's why we end up repeating childhood, what we saw in our childhood, what our parents did, is because it's all we know. We don't have any other frame of reference to go from. It's all we know. And so some of it's subconscious. We don't even realize that we're thinking that way or acting that way. We just suddenly wake up and why am I like this? And a lot of it has to do with what happened to us as children. Now, I'll give you an example. My father was a drug smuggler, and what that obviously is going to cause in my family as I was growing up is we were very secretive in our family. So, basically through my father's sin, it taught me how to lie and project a certain image to others of everything's cool with me, everything's fine with me. And now I say this, this is something my parents encouraged me to do while my father was in a lot of his unlawful practices of drug smuggling. And my father knew what was right and he knew what was wrong. But he just did the best that he could with what he had. And his father had issues. And so my dad carried that into his parenting style. So what ended up happening is we had all these family secrets and nobody really knew me. I couldn't be really real with most of my friends. And there was an example of one time where we had a camper and my father had these bushels of marijuana in this camper, and he called me to help him with something, and I didn't know what he needed. And so I went in there, and there must have been about 30 bushels of marijuana in there, and one of them had broken open, and he needed my help to put it back in, and we literally had a police officer that lived across the street from us. In fact, it was one of my friend's dads. And so you can imagine the pressure this put on me as a child to protect my father in a very unhealthy way. And so, this dysfunction just continued into my teenage years, into my adulthood. And so I didn't have this healthy relationship with my dad where my dad was protecting me. My dad and I didn't have a close emotional connection. He was not teaching me the greatest examples. And because he was so caught up in his own sin, he wasn't giving me the attention, the identity, and the approval that God created him to give to his daughter. And so what happened to me is I started seeking approval from other men because I wasn't getting it in my relationship with my dad. This carried into my marriage with me expecting my husband to meet needs that only my father of origin could meet, and then eventually God could meet in my life as I became an adult. But I didn't have that close emotional relationship with my dad. And so it killed my confidence in basically standing up for what is right. And I was always ended up being intimidated by men and strove to earn their love, admiration, respect, whatever you want to call it, through this perfect performance. And it's kind of like what kids go through when they have an alcoholic father or an alcoholic parent, is they're always trying to cover for their parents. And so that's what I did. And even when my marriage started cycling down, I felt like I was always having to cover for my husband. That was part of my job. And, today I still wrestle. Even after we worked through a lot of our core issues and our core wounds, I still wrestle with being completely vulnerable. It's something I'm working really hard on. I pursue it with all my heart, but it's still something I have to thrust. I have to thrust my sin into the light so that I can be real. I can be seen for who I am. I can get the real help that I need. I always want to present this image of having everything all together, the typical American mom, woman who's got it all together, that is my tendency as well. And it's crazy because I thought that my childhood was normal and healthy until I really started looking at it objectively. I looked at it subjectively, and that's why I was messed up, until I started looking at it objectively. And I really saw then my childhood was a mess because both my parents were a mess. And like I said, they tried the best they could. They were noble-hearted as much as they could be with what they were dealt. And the same thing with my grandparents. They did the best that they could. But because the sin wasn't dealt with, it manifested even into my life. Now, I've got 3 kids, and I don't want it to manifest in my children's life. So if we really want to break the chains of our family's transgenerational sins, we have to constantly fight against this default literally written into our DNA. We have to go after it deliberately, purposefully. We can't hide ourselves from it. There's 2 really good books by John and Karen Louie. One is called Good Enough Parenting, and the other one is called I Choose Us. The I Choose Us is a book on marriage, and the Good Enough Parenting obviously is about parenting, but it talks about how to identify those things in your past and to see how they're going to impact your marriage and your relationship with your kids, how you're going to parent. They really help you identify the core wounds, okay? So I highly recommend those. Now, how do we address those core wounds for a successful marriage? So short of you getting the books, how do you do it? Where can you start? How can you start right now? Now, first thing is both people have to want it. Now, we're going to look over here in Proverbs chapter 2. And he says, my son, this is Solomon, my son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding. Indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He holds success in store for the upright. He is a shield to those whose walk is blameless, for he guards the course of the just and protects the way of his faithful ones. All right, so here you can see in Proverbs that Solomon was even encouraging his son, God is the one who's going to provide that, but we have to be deliberate about this knowledge. God knows everything that's inside of you. He knows everything that's happened to you. All the core things that you probably buried and tried to forget, he knows they're all there. And he is so gentle in the way that he cares for us and helping those things come out, just like an onion that he gradually peels back one layer at a time. And he only gives us what we can handle, but we have to pursue it. And see, if your spouse isn't seeking repentance or healing or trying to find these, then you have to focus on yourself. You have to focus on dealing with your core wounds so that if your spouse changes, like I was fortunate enough to have my spouse, and I won't even say fortunate, I was grateful and blessed and grateful my husband decided to make the changes. But I had to be prepared for that. I had to deal with my own stuff because otherwise we were going to go right back into the same kind of marriage that we had before. I would not have been ready for us to reconcile. So regardless of our spouse's choices, we still are responsible for our relationship with God. There's a passage in James chapter 5, verse 16, I think it is, that anyone then who knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it sins. So we can't say, well, my husband's not dealing with his issue, so why do I have to deal with mine? Because God says we have to. Because God says we've all sinned and we've fallen short of the glory of God. And that's in Romans 3:23. And so therefore we are responsible for addressing these things in our life. In Luke 13 verses 1 through 5, there was an example where some of the people came up to Jesus and they were saying, all these bad things happened to these people, an accidents that happened, and they were tortured in some ways. And Jesus is like, do you think there were any worse than you? He's like, no, you've got to repent and change. So we can't look at anybody else. We can't blame anybody else or get obsessed with anybody else's issues, even our spouses or our parents. We have to focus on our own healing. Now in John chapter 21, this actually happened with Jesus and Peter. So after Jesus had come back, resurrected, he was giving Peter his direction and encouraging him to move forward with the kingdom. And it says that, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. That was John. And actually he said, well, what about him? I didn't put that in the passage here. He says, Peter said to him, well, what about him? And Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. All right. So ultimately, no matter what is going on, we are still responsible for dealing with our issues. Even if our spouse never changes, we are still responsible for our personal relationship with God and dealing with these things in our heart that are damaging all of our relationships. And if we have children, impacting our kids. So with God at the center, okay, which is such a huge part of our growth, God helps us move in a direction so that we can be healed and he gives us all the different things that we need. We've got the word, we have healthy relationships, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But with God at the center of it, it makes a huge difference when it comes to our marriage and our parenting. I'm going to show you a graphic here. Okay, so this is a graphic. So you see this triangle of relationships, God at the top, all right, you and your spouse at the bottom. Now, what happens when both people move toward God? Okay, both people move toward God, and then what happens to their relationship? They move toward each other. That is the way that God designed it, okay? That we move toward, as we move closer to God, we move closer together because we're both becoming more obedient to God. We're connecting with God. We're becoming more humble. We're being obedient to the scriptures. And as we do that, we become more unified with each other. That's the way God designed it, that God has to be first in our relationship. Now in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 16, he says, I will lead the blind by ways they have not known. Along unfamiliar paths I will guide them. I will turn the darkness into light before them and make the rough places smooth. So when we are getting into dealing with these core wounds, it's going to feel like foreign territory. In fact, it's going to be scary. We are not going to want to see these things. They bring pain. They bring heartbreak. And it's like, how do I do this? How do I go about doing this? So we're going to have to do things that we've never done before. And it's going to be scary. But God is going to lead us to hope and healing. All right? So one of the other things we can do is we can get professional help from a Christian counselor experienced in dealing with core wounds. Now, the reason sometimes it's really important that we have a Christian counselor is because they can uncover things that nobody else can. They have the experience and the education to be able to do that. Not all of them, and I'm going to say that as another caveat here, is that it's super important that we really do our research on the Christian counselors. I totally believe in counseling. I've had some amazing counselors. I have friends that are counselors, and they're wonderful. But there are specialties that they have, and you really need to make sure that you have a Christian counselor who specializes in helping people deal with those core wounds and how they impact their current life. Now, in Proverbs 20, verse 5, it says, the intentions of a man's heart are deep waters, but a man or woman of understanding draws them out. And see, that's what has to happen is these things are buried deep down, and we need people who have the wisdom and the experience, the spiritual wisdom, using the scriptures to help draw those things out of our character. They can teach us how to do that. Now, we also need to surround ourselves with safe, supportive, spiritual companions that will hold up our arms when we get tired, when we get weary, when we feel like we can't do this anymore. We have those people in our lives that don't try to fix us, but they support us. They encourage us. They don't, force us to try to make decisions that we're not ready for. They help us to look at the options and let us make those choices. I love in Exodus chapter 17, verses 12 through 14, when the Israelites were crossing the Red Sea. And God said for Moses to keep his arms up. And as long as his arms were up, the waters would stay parted. And it took a long time for 1 million people to go through the sea. And so, him standing there. So what happened? Joshua and his brother Aaron got up and held up Moses' arms until all the people got through. I think that's such a metaphor for us really having people in our lives that hold up our arms until our family, all these issues can get worked through in our lives. And we have those people to support us. Okay, super important. Now, I realize, and I want you to realize, this is really important. I keep saying it's important, but these are all important. There is no magic bullet to healing. We in the United States, especially in the West, we want things to happen now. We want everything quick. We want our apps to work right away. We want our internet to work super fast. We want fast food. We want everything instant. It translates into wanting healing instantly, and it doesn't work that way. We spent years, sometimes decades, with this stuff in our life, and it doesn't just change magically. It's going to be a long, hard, painful slog through the muck and the mud until we get to healing. But there is a purpose in our pain. Now I want to look at my last scripture. It's Hebrews 12. We're going to look at verses 1 through 13. So it's a little bit long passage, but there's nothing that quite says it the way that the scriptures do. So instead of me saying it, we're going to let God say it. So therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you do not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding your blood like he did. And you have forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastens everyone he accepts as his son or daughter. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what child is not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it, even if they didn't do it perfectly. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good in order that we may, what? Share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. We're not going to remain lame. We're not going to stay where we are. God has a purpose in our pain, okay? Now, we have to have the right motives for getting out of this, okay? Part of it is to fulfill God's purpose in our life, as we just looked at in Hebrews 12. Another part of it is to find that peace that passes understanding. If you've got all these things going in your life, you probably don't have a lot of peace here and in here, and you don't even know why. So we can have a peace that passes understanding as we pursue really working through these core wounds. It gives us an opportunity to claim the freedom that Jesus made for us on the cross. He was the prisoner releaser, as he says in Luke, that he came to release prisoners. And also it gives us a chance to help our children to live without the same chains that we have lived with. I mean, do you want your kids to have the same life that you did? Or do you want them to have something better? Do you want them to have a better life than they can ever possibly imagine? I know I do. I want my kids to not have to go through what I've gone through. And ultimately, it's part of discipleship, is to lead others along the same path, to help them walk out of this prison that they've been in. Now, if you're sick and tired of being a victim to your childhood wounds, okay? If you're ready to face the fear that those demons have brought, if you're ready to embrace the pain of your brokenness, and if you're ready to move purposefully and deliberately toward victory and peace, no matter how long it takes, and if you're ready to do something about it today, then I want you to schedule a call with me, because we will get on the phone and we will talk through and we will help you get a plan for direction, for guidance, so that you really can deal with these things that have been sitting on your back, sitting in your heart for so long and weighing you down. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and post that. Schedule your free breakthrough call right here at hopeforspouses.com/call. Again, hopeforspouses.com/call. If you are watching this on YouTube, I would appreciate if you give us a thumbs up if this was helpful for you, and go ahead and subscribe. So we will be seeing you next week on the Hope for Spouses Lunchtime Live.